Cool. Okay, so hello everyone. Thank you for joining today's ODI lunchtime lecture. My name's Emily and I'm a project delivery manager here at the ODI. I'm joined today by Claire Rampen, who's the co-founder of Reath. Reath was founded in 2019 and they are on a mission to build the digital infrastructure required for businesses to shift to the circular economy. The topic of today's lecture is specifically around building an open data standard for reusable packaging. Just a bit of housekeeping before we get going. This is being recorded for our YouTube channel. I hope that's okay. Please also keep your mic muted and your video off during the presentation. There will be some time for questions at the end, but submit them in the chat function as we go along, and then at the end I'll ask you to unmute and ask your question, or I can ask it for you. So that's it. Thanks so much for joining it, everyone, and over to you, Claire.
Fantastic. Great. So, hi, everybody. This is really exciting. My name is Claire. I co-founded a company in 2019 building an open data standard for reusable packaging. Before we get started, I'd be interested to know in the comments if anyone could pop in, did you join because you're interested in reusable packaging, or maybe you always join the lunchtime lectures because you're just really interested in data standards and what the work that the ODI does, because it'd be really interesting to see. I can't. Realized. Okay, well, we can return to that at the end. So I'm going to talk to you about building an open data standard for reusable packaging. And I think what's really important is to take you back to the beginning really, and the problem. So I, like many people, was really tired of seeing more and more waste pile up in landfill. It really felt like there was no alternative to the single-use model, and I was really tired of being complicit in that as well, as many of you probably feel. My frustration was really focused on businesses because I felt like, why were they allowed to knowingly pollute and profit from it? And why had they not come up with something better than the single-use model already? So my co-founder, Emily, and I had really done a lot on our own side to take individual action, but it became really clear to me early on, and all you have to do is think about it for 2 minutes to realize that systemic change is needed. You just cannot rely on individuals to make their own sort of harder choices than the convenient single-use options that are available. So we started emailing and calling brands that we bought from to ask them why they weren't adopting reusable packaging. And we started with a focus on cosmetic companies, because I don't know how many of you here use those kinds of products, but that product, I mean, it's highly unrecyclable. It's laminated materials to make it look nicer, fancier. And as reusable packaging seemed like the best and most efficient way to be resourceful. Campaign where we were calling all the brands and getting an understanding from them as to why they weren't using reusable packaging. Their responses started coming back, and the excuses really fell into 3 main buckets. The first was saying, we can't do it, it's against regulation. And they often cited batch codes, which are those little printed numbers that you see stamped onto bottles. So it's an established rule for consumer safety for understandable reasons, products that you put into bottles or packaging and consumers. So if you do ever need to do a product recall, so for example, if you find out that your product has been contaminated, you can do that relatively easily. This felt like a very reasonable concern, but just nothing that couldn't be overcome. The second bucket of responses we had was people saying that it's just too big a change. All their processes, all their systems are set up for linear. So they essentially would buy it both physically in terms of the reverse logistics, but also digitally in terms of the systems that they've got set up to manage them. And then the third thing was that we really found it was more of an attitude than a challenge, but businesses were really stuck. It's an expensive shift to move to reusable, and they wanted to get it right first time. But there's not really any data that you can learn from when you're designing a system like that. So you don't know how many times the packaging will be reused. You don't know how many times it's going to have to withstand cleaning. You don't know how many, like what kind of design choices might impact that lifespan. You have no idea what the consumer is going to do with it or expect from it. So all of those questions that we got back from them and the challenges really made it clear that it was not an easy problem to solve. That being said, I don't think that's an excuse not to do it, particularly when you look at the amount of money that a lot of these businesses have. So we were really sold on the idea of reuse models, mostly because we'd done a lot of research, reading a lot of the literature that Ellen MacArthur Foundation has put out. And if you haven't come across them before, I'd really recommend having a look at what they publish. So they have these 4 return models or refill models, and their thesis is that really, if we're going to reach any kind of a sustainable consumption model and divert the amount, then we're going to have about 20% of our products in reusable packaging in order to make that possible and feasible. So to go back to those challenges all the business posed to us, we decided it was the time that we would just go out and see for ourselves how difficult that was. So maybe naively, we bought some products, sort of hand wash, shower gel, that kind of thing. And we bought some bottles that could be reused. And then we designed a system that meant we could check out each bottle when it was sold and then check it back in, kind of like a library book. And it was a very primitive Google Sheet. And we went out to did little pop-up shops, and we sold and got these bottles returned. So it was very easy to break this system, but ultimately, in its basic form, it worked. Of course, as these always do, that test generated hundreds of other questions and challenges about how this could ever fit into an existing business. But I think most critically, it be done here, and it will serve all the businesses who are trying to transition to reuse. So that's all that make up that 20% of their products in reuse models. If we're to follow the Ellen MacArthur Foundation ambition, they will all have these same challenges. So with that in mind, we applied for a grant from Innovate UK, the Smart Sustainable Plastic Packaging Fund, just very neatly came out at the right time. And we applied to start building one of the foundational blocks for a product like this, which is an open data standard. So I'm pausing for a moment to mention why we felt this was a worthwhile way to go. Emily had worked at a company selling over 100,000 different types of knitting, wool, and sewing thread from thousands of small businesses. So she was already starting to anticipate the pain points around ingesting the necessary product data with. We'd also seen a few companies in our space that had built an open data standard for recycling clothing fabric and realized the power of aggregate insights there, in particular, when you want to get some learnings about how different materials respond when you're doing something new with them, like reusing them. And then the third reason was I'd met Dom Fennell from IMIN, who worked on Open Active with the team at the ODI. And so and that was a few years back, and I was aware of the open data standard concept from him talking to me about it. And I mentioned that because you never know literally never know where inspiration will come from. Or I remember at the time thinking, gosh, I wonder how that applies to any other industry. And then here we are, quite a few years later. So we were very fortunate to receive funding from Innovate UK, and we kicked off the project with support from Dr. Ellsworth Krebs, who's a sustainability researcher at Lancaster University, and laterally with support from and Lee. And we'd really read a lot and used a lot of the tools provided by the ODI for free on the website to begin the process. So it was quite an amazing opportunity to then revisit that work with the experts in the room. And I've got some examples of that later in the talk. So I'd already mentioned that the responses we had from businesses were telling us that reuse is really difficult. So I thought we could dive which can help over challenges. I took this picture of an egg box that I get delivered along some vegetables. On one hand, reuse seems so simple, seems so intuitive. On the other hand, has a lot of problems if you want to do it properly. So as you can see, someone has use. And I think this image is great because it sums up the reason why big brands are really scared about how to make this scale and how they can make this work. So that takes me.
Claire, I'm very sorry to interrupt. It's Freya here. I'm just checking, and a few of us are having, it sounds like bandwidth issues on your account. I'm really sorry to do this, but could I ask you to switch off your video just to see if that helps with the connection? I know we would all much prefer to see you, but it might just help with the dropout.
No, that's very strange. Sorry, I have, it seemed to have full Wi-Fi capacity, but that's, oh well, the pleasures of working from home. Is this better?
I think that is. If it doesn't make any difference, I'll drop you a message and you can switch your camera back on. But let's see if it improves things.
Okay, thank you. So to remind you of the 3 challenges that we'd identified when we spoke to the businesses originally, they were around regulation, so health and safety, also environmental compliance, integration with existing business systems, and then lastly, the insights that are needed to plan or optimize a system of reuse. And this is really where we mapped the application of an open data standard directly and realized there was a huge potential here. So an open data standard requirements, there's already some really specific ones around health and safety, making sure, so we spoke to environmental health officers who were able to lay those out for us. There's also companies have signed up to things like the New Plastic Economy Global Commitment or the UK Plastic Pact, and they have their own specific reporting requirements. On the integration side, there's, while these linear systems or these systems that businesses operate on already are an opportunity there for, if you have a standardized set of data, for third parties to be able to build infrastructure that helps people adopt reuse, which was very much where we first saw ourselves working. And then lastly, if you're using standardized data, it means you can capture aggregate insights based on reuse data. So you could feed that all into a materials library, for example, or you could use it, an academic could use it to understand the reuse patterns of customers and here. So we'd never built an open data standard before. I'm sure there's not that many people who have in the world. So we lent very heavily on the ODI's resources. And I'm going to talk you a little bit through how we went on this journey and conducted this process, and hopefully inspire you to do this for your domain if it's of interest to you. So I've included 2 here that we were working with. So to begin at the beginning, the ecosystem map is essentially a map of all the organizations who publish or receive data within a certain domain, and then the data infrastructure that allows that data to flow between them. And the exercise is really designed to help you identify the stakeholders. So who should you speak to? In our case, this meant anyone who is involved in the production, use, sale, and disposal of packaging, and to surface any data sets that already exist. So we found the National Waste Database this way, for example. And lastly, it's a great way to identify opportunities. So we realized in this case that there was no one piece of data infrastructure that was helping to enable this, this sharing of data across the ecosystem. And that was a really good opportunity for us. I've included 2 pictures. I did that literally listening to the ODI's webinar and kind of plotting them out as I went. And then the second version that we did very much still in draft mode, but with the ODI. And I wanted to include this because I think it shows that you can never, ever, this is never a project that's done. So we had already conducted about 75% of our planned interviews. And the second version that we did with the ODI really identified the gaps that we still had in our knowledge and the new stakeholders and contributors that we needed to speak to. So this led us, ultimately the data ecosystem mapping led us to identify the key categories of stakeholders who would be critical in defining the necessary data points that we needed for the core open data standard. And we identified 4 broad categories. We wanted to group them because otherwise with sort of subcategories within them, so that we were able to start actually coming to some conclusions, because one of the challenging things is you're just a little bit overwhelmed with qualitative data during this process. So we got, yes, we identified the manufacturing. These are the brands who produce the consumer goods which are packaged. So think of your, I don't know, your Nestle's or your Unilevers. We also identified a category of retailers and supermarkets. So they're the companies that have the relationship, obviously, with the individual consumer, but so with. We identified the environmental compliance bodies. These are the relevant national organizations who are in charge of upholding the environmental safeguarding policies and ensuring that businesses comply with regulation. And then there was the health and safety bodies, so the relevant national and local organizations who make sure that companies uphold health and safety standards and really. So I've included some examples here of how we went about kind of synthesizing that data. We conducted, 1 hour long interviews with all these different respondents, and we had 25 of them, pulled that all in into transcripts, and then we sifted through it and tried to identify in a very simplistic form, using the user story format. We would identify who it was that made the statement, what they wanted to do, and essentially why they wanted to do that. And we started gathering these for every single interview until we had about 50 different user stories. From there, we were able to pull them into a much more consolidated and comprehensive set of use cases. So this was trying to explain exactly what they would use the data standard for. And I've again done the example of the environmental compliance. So we boiled it down for the environmental protection officer, actually just 2 use cases. We went through this process several times until we had come up with some key findings and were able to back them up with the use cases, the user stories, and ultimately the actual quotes from the interviews that we conducted. So this takes me to the last part, which was around the challenges we found. And this has been really, really helpful to get the ODI's support and guidance on, which was when you start building a standard, you sort of want to start standardizing everything, and then you realize that there's no end to that. So we were looking, for example, at materials, and we were looking at something like a PET plastic bottle, for example. We weren't sure if we should start trying to standardize all the different types of materials it could be. If you have a bottle, it could be PET, it could be HDPE, it could be aluminium, it could be glass. There's all these different types of materials that could make up the form. So we weren't sure if we should try to standardize those, or if we should try and pull on existing lists. And that was really, really helpful to get the guidance from the ODI, which was very much strip it back. You look at your core data points that you can standardize, and pull in other sets where you can. And that was really, really useful. The second challenge that we found was use of the standard across industries. So packaging is obviously spans many industries. We've spoken a lot to people in the food and drink and cosmetics space because they're essentially the backbone of the fast-moving consumer goods and the largest packaging polluters. But there's obviously a lot of different types of packaging, and we were finding that you could end up going down rabbit holes and having very, very specific data points for each industry. And then the last challenge that we found was adapting the standard to new assets. So one of the obviously in the last 9-12 months, the biggest challenges that the world has faced has been COVID. And we were very fortunate to win another Innovate UK grant to take what we were doing and apply it to reusable PPE. This then, we then essentially had to take the standard and try and adapt to the new different requirements and do it on a fast-tracked way because COVID response has had to be very quick. So that was a really interesting challenge that we came across. And again, the guidance from the ODI, which was incredibly helpful, was really trying to not to get lost and distracted by all the different data points you possibly could add in, and really trying to strip it back to the core and make sure that you had a very strong core of your standard. So that's a whistle-stop tour of the work that we've been doing. And I would love your questions and comments and thoughts. And we're going to be publishing our white paper and our draft standard in a few weeks' time. So yes, I will welcome more contributions and comments and feedback then as well. Thank you.
Cool, thank you. That was really, really interesting. There is a sort of question on the chat, which Tom, I don't know if you want to specifically ask that. It's or if it was more of a comment.
No, I'm happy to ask the question. So yeah, I was just interested to know if you've managed to talk to anyone at OPRL, Claire, just because we have good connections with people at OPRL, and I know that they might be quite interested in this.
No, I don't know anyone there. That would be really interesting.
Okay, cool. So yeah, so I'm Tom from Disposal. We're working on an open data standard all around waste. So it feels like there's a lot of crossover here. So that was fantastic. I really enjoyed the talk. But yeah, I'll get some contact details off you, and then I'll put you in touch with Margaret at OPRL.
Cool, thank you.
Yeah, that would be great. Thank you. I'd love that.
I guess I had a question, which I guess is less to do with like businesses, but in like the grand scheme of your work, do you envisage how like your end consumer, like your average person like me or you, who, like you said at the beginning, was like kind of frustrated with the kind of general situation of recycling and pollution, like how do you potentially view their role in this kind of, I guess, blue sky thinking a little?
Yeah, great question. So they were part of our ecosystem map, and then we removed them and then we put them back in again. We didn't want to get distracted, but I think they are critical. So one of the ways that we identified that it could be really beneficial for them, although they ideally would never really know, is the fact that you could start. So right now, lots of reuse systems, because there are a lot, and they're sort of in their own niches, and they're often direct to consumer companies, they will reward you for bringing packaging back. But if every single company has their own system, it's really, you could never link that up to something like a general loyalty card, like a Boots card or a points card that was, whatever brand it might be. So there's an opportunity there to be able to basically align incentives for the consumer with behaviors, and be able to actually accurately attribute behaviors to an individual consumer. That obviously would require linking to the ORM database essentially, but there's that lays the ground for the potential of doing that, whereas right now it could never happen. I noticed that there's a question from Joe.
Yes. Joe, did you want to ask that?
Joe, that's a great question.
Sorry.
Well, yeah, I think it's quite self-explanatory, the question, but it's more just a question of why can't that happen here? I lived in Denmark for a while, and it works super well with having an extra charge on a bottle when you bought it and then you returning them and getting it back. And just wondered why that had never cropped up here.
Yeah. Did Joe jump out? Yeah, so that's a really interesting question. And we spoke to someone who works, both their company operates in the UK and in Germany, and they were telling us about the returnable bottle situation there. And they were saying that there's not really, because the physical infrastructure is there, and because the habitual and the consumer behavior is already established there, there's actually, they don't really need to know much more beyond, that it's working, which it does. However, in the UK, because we don't have that physical infrastructure, first off, and we don't have the consumer behavior, they were saying that they're going to need to be have some much smarter incentives, or they're going to have to, having a digital infrastructure can let you trial it in a way when you don't have the physical infrastructure, because you can, for example, have decentralized collection points, or you have a lot more control when you're able to track everything. Whereas when you don't, you can't, and it only works when everything's working. Interestingly, though, in the UK, Scotland is meant to be, it was meant to have a deposit return scheme come into play from next year onwards. Then COVID has delayed that by a couple of years. And I believe that England isn't far behind. So you might be paying a deposit on every single bottle and can in the near future.
Cool. Thank you. I don't see any other questions in the chat. I don't know if anyone wants to jump in just now with any final thoughts or questions.
Could I ask another question? It's Tom from Disposal again.
Of course.
Claire, have you been able to do any life cycle analysis around the environmental impact of single use versus recyclable or reusable, and kind of the energy, and kind of the additional energy costs at requirement to move these reusable items around and then refill them and wash them and clean them up?
Yeah. Sorry, I think the bandwidth is so a few things there. First of all, the different reuse models and refill models, like the Ellen MacArthur quadrant, all have different implications for carbon footprint, essentially. But as many of you probably know, the largest impact on carbon footprint is going to be, well, transport miles are a huge part of that. So we're really interested in where people are sending packaging to and from. And if you're working with a direct-to-consumer company, you have the benefit of being able to know exactly where it left the warehouse, what address it was sent to, and then equally where it was sent back to. So you can start calculating that. That's definitely on our calculate those numbers on a rough basis and feed them back to people who are working on this. But it's a really important piece of information to be keeping your eye on. I know that all the companies that we spoke to that do reuse already, their reuse rate is a really critical KPI for them, because they are aware that if they can't get their reuse rate as high as possible, they're possibly going to be having a worse environmental impact than if they were to have a really high reuse rate and be making the saving on the reuse of packaging.
Perfect, thank you.
Cool. I think that might be everything, unless, any other final questions or thoughts. Otherwise, your website, I think, is reath.id, right? If anybody wants to go and check out your other work, or just get some more background on the work that you've been doing. Otherwise, thanks so much. That was really interesting. Thank you everyone for joining. I hope it was useful, and this will be up on YouTube. Should you want to rewatch it.
Thanks so much, Emily. Really appreciate it. And I'm sorry to hear about the bandwidth issues. That's a shame. But we're putting a blog out on the ODI's blog as well, so there'll be some of the key details there. And if you're interested in understanding anything else, then feel free to get in touch.
Perfect. Thank you so much, and thank you
very much
for joining.